Hey, well, what's up, everyone? Welcome back to The Collision. Daniel here, and I am honored today to be joined by a very special guest, and that is Mr. Andrew Kightlinger. He is the director of the upcoming exciting movie Lost on a Mountain in Maine, hitting theaters November 1st. Thanks so much for taking the time just to chat about this new film.
Thank you for having me. It's a bright-eyed, bushy-tailed. I love it.
Why don't we start right at the beginning and kind of start a bit with you, and then we'll get into some of the stuff going on in this film. Let me say first off, too, I've seen this film and it's fantastic. I really enjoyed this
Thank you.
film. I think a
Thank
lot
you.
of people are going to enjoy this when they see it in the theaters on November 1st. But what about you? Like, how did you first become attached to this story? And perhaps, like, what about this particular narrative just kind of made you think, like, hey, I need to be the one to tell this story?
It's a great question. I tried to make a movie for everybody. That's kind of the goal. And I think a lot of that has to do with just my background. I grew up in a lot of places and saw a lot of the world and was, part of a lot of religions, but experienced a lot of different religions as I was growing up Lutheran. And I realized that like a universal message is the most unifying message. And so this movie is kind of tapping into that hope and family and whatnot. And in terms of like how I got the job, it was the classic kind of boring interview process where, Stallone's company, got the rights to this true story, and they were looking for somebody who I think had wilderness prowess as a director, and also I think who came with a certain earnestness about the world. But I'm sort of an ever optimist, and I just went through a very boring, rigorous like interview process for about 3 months, but it ultimately culminated with me being flown out to northern Maine to Baxter State Park and hiking the Titular Mountain, which that was my final interview. And that mountain is known as the hardest non-technical day hike in America. So it's a mile up, no switchbacks. It's like doing the stair stepper for 6 hours straight, one way up. And luckily I'm a distance runner, so I was ready for it, but it kind of kicked my butt a little bit. I'm not gonna lie, but I made it to the top. I got the job soon after.
Well, yeah, I was going to ask you if part of the preparation for this was you had to go hike a mountain in Maine and hopefully not get lost.
Part of it. It wasn't required, but I'm glad I did because got me in the mindset of a kid.
Yeah, well, you mentioned before too that you have had a unique upbringing. You've lived in some interesting places. I believe that you grew up in Madagascar, where your parents were missionaries. You kind of already alluded to it a bit, but was there anything about just sort of that unique upbringing that either like prepared you to make this film, or that you were able to bring with you to this story?
I think in a myriad of ways. So my parents were medical missionaries for the Lutheran Church for the ALCA for 30 years, and and they worked in villages and remote places in the rainforest a lot of the times, sometimes weeks on end. And my dad would like backpack into these villages, and they would set up clinics, and they would do vaccination clinics and whatnot. And with every vaccine, you'd get the Book of John. That was kind of the proselytizing was very subtle in a way. And yeah, and at first glance, when I read the script, I'd never heard of the story before. It's this kind of true story that's a little part of a tiny pocket of American history in 1939, and I never heard of it. But what I related to was my childhood was a lot of walking around barefoot because I wasn't raised in a boarding school. I was raised in the bush with Malagasy children. I grew up Malagasy. I grew up French and like the Malagasy language, my first language. And I grew up barefoot walking through the rainforest with other kids. So I immediately latched on to this kid alone in the forest walking barefoot. That was sort of my like visual entry point. But beyond that, this is the type of movie you don't see anymore. And when I was growing up in the 80s, early 90s, we had these movies, White Fang, Alaska, Black Stallion, Empire of the Sun, The Goonies, even to some degree, right? These movies that had a certain optimism about the world and taught people something good about the world. And so I kind of just, that's what I latched onto. I'm like, I'm going to make one of these. We're going to shoot a lot of it practically and build the sets. And it's going to be nostalgic and at the same time, hopefully timeless in a way that this can be watched for decades to come with families.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I'm a father. I have two young, soon to be 10-year-old boys, and you're right. These aren't the type of films
They're
that
the
you
target
see in the
audience.
theaters. Yeah, you don't see these types of movies very often. One of the interesting things about this movie that I wanted to see sort of the decision process for it, because kind of all throughout this film, you've made the decision to like intercut like interviews with the real figures that were involved in this, almost giving it, at least at times, like a documentary type feel, although it's, very much still like a cinematic narrative. What was the thinking behind sort of including some of those real life archival elements?
So that was a decision that was made in the editing process. So as we made the film, we had that archival footage was used to write the movie. The movie is not a direct adaptation of the book upon which this is based, because that's just first person POV, the kid alone in the woods. But we also had the family story through these archival interviews. And I think in editing, the movie worked on its own, but we asked ourselves a question like, why does the story matter? Like, what makes it special? And I think we started using it because almost as chapter headings to guide the audience along to remind you this actually happened. And these things you're seeing, like, these are not. I think a lot of the story beats in this movie could kind of seem like Hollywoodized if you didn't know the context of it. But then you hear the actual mother talking about, oh, this happened. You go, oh, okay. So to me, it was important for the audience to know that seemingly unbelievable things actually do happen in real life. And seemingly like the triumph of the human spirit is a real human thing. And so that's why we ended up incorporating those. And I've grown. At first, I kind of pushed back on the idea. It wasn't even my idea as a director, to be honest. Producer like, oh, we need something to spice this up, and now I've grown to love it. I think it elevates the movie and gives it a unique kind of spin that I think is, even though the movie's for kids technically, I think it gives away an entry point for adults as well.
Yeah, it does ground, and I found it effective. I think the first time trying to figure out what's going on here, and as it went on, it adds a sense of stakes and this realism to the story. I think kind of on the
Right.
surface, this is sort of like a boy versus nature, like a survival story, but I think it's deeper than that. And in many ways, this is more a movie about family. And I think particularly kind of the relational dynamic between a father and a son. Kind of how important was that more relational component to you as you approach this film?
It was everything. I always say, like, survival movies are a dime a dozen, in my opinion. And to me, what's more important is the why behind it all. So I think for this, one of my entry points is I have a very good relationship with my father. My mother passed away when I was 21, so it's been almost 20 years, and he and I got even closer. And I think that parent child dynamic, no matter what age you are, is very important. Um, and in the end, when the stakes are high or when hope seems forever lost, what is the thing that you cling to? And in my head, it's your family, it's your faith, it's those kind of bedrock things that you grew up learning about or that are closest to you. Those are the things that keep you going. So for me to make a movie about a boy who ultimately just wants a hug from his father, that's really what the movie's about for me, was just a very simple, clean, pure message in a time where movies, I think, try to overindulge or movies are very cynical. We just, there's an election coming up and there's all this noise around us. And I just wanted to make a movie about a very pure message, which is that, say I love you to your kids because it can save their life, you know?
Yeah, yeah, I think almost, more than just like a survival movie. To me, this seems like a movie, kind of like the things that we survive for. You mentioned family. I also wanted to touch on the faith part. Like you said at the start, this is a universal movie. This is not by any means like a real preachy religious movie, but it is one that the characters in this film are faith. And even Don, like the little boy that gets lost on the mountain, does find a very like I think touching, like almost like companionship with God. He's out, isolated in the wilderness and just very like raw and I think honest prayers between him and God throughout this film. What kind of role does faith play in this story?
Well, you touched on it that because of my upbringing, because Madagascar is a country that's basically split 50-50 between like Christianity and Islam. And also there's like animism, in villages and things. But I saw kind of firsthand how a message of like hope and healing and family can kind of cross through and bleed through everything. So my goal, I'm a very ecumenical thinker when it comes to religion. I went to college at a private Lutheran college. Like I spent part of my life for a long time. I was in a choir, Lutheran choir, and I just saw how faith transcends everything if you really let it. So my goal with this movie is that anybody of any faith, of any belief, you can even not believe in God if you wanted to, and you can come and be touched by this idea that believing in something higher than yourself um, can bring you to salvation. And ultimately in this movie, Don, and I love that you mentioned like that spirit character in the film, uh, I think can be divisive in some way, but to me, that is God in any way that you want to see it, right? It can be the Christian guy, it can be whatever you want it to be. It can also just be that thing that children sometimes cling to in order to the fantasies we create in order to survive and cope with a traumatic situation. So I wanted to keep it universal because for me, the more the preacher a movie gets, I think the more limiting the message can be, and the less people will respond to it. So for me, it's like, Martin Scorsese makes religious movies, it's but everybody sees them, and he's talking about faith in a lot of ways. So that was kind of my that's the way, like, if I were to be a pastor through a movie, for example, this is kind of the way I would do it, is like bring everybody into the fold, so to speak. But it's not in your face. It's very much there, and you can do what you want with it as an audience.
Yeah,
To
and
me,
very
that's
much
just
grounded
that's
in the character
yeah,
of Don in this film and
yeah.
authentic to him. What about just some challenges for this film? I know this. I'm assuming recreating a storm atop a mountain. I mean, even just working with primarily with young actors who are fantastic in this movie as well. What were some of the challenges that you kind of had to overcome just to bring this story onto the screen?
They are fantastic. All the kids are delightful and also delightful human beings. Hire them again, Hollywood. Um, but yeah, I mean, there are child labor laws and all these wonderful protections that we have where you can't bring children to the top of an actual mountain. So what we did is all the mountain sequences of the movie are a combination of real footage on the mountain. Like we crew climbed the mountain in a storm to get actual footage, but it was just the crew. So a lot of what you're seeing is real on top of that mountain. A lot of people think we didn't shoot this in Maine. A lot of it was shot in Maine. But then what we did in order for safety, we built our production design team built an 80-foot by 80-foot replica of the peak of the mountain. And they even hired like lichen experts who studied what the lichen at the top of the mountain was, and they came in and they painted it so it look as real as possible, and then the right grasses and everything. Pretty amazing piece of design work. And I wanted that. We could have done everything in CG, but I wanted like a real set, so it felt like something that we'd seen in the 80s and 90s, or all the best stuff in Jurassic Park is the stuff that's practical, right? That looks real and tangible. And so that was the goal. And so we ended up making this thing in a sound stage. It was actually a wedding venue that we turned into a sound stage. And had these giant, 10-foot tall fans and sprinkler systems and fog machines. And for 3 days, we just pummeled these poor children with these elements, and they had a great time. It was like summer camp for them. They were game, and it's movie magic. What's not to love? But that's how we achieved a lot of that.
Yeah, and it's beautiful. There's a lot of really beautiful shots. Almost that tension between, hey, there's danger, there's things out there that are gonna, threaten to kill you, and yet there's also beauty and just almost that like primal, this joy. There's a couple of great scenes where, Don the boy is just enjoying the fact that he's a boy out in the wild. He's
Yeah,
having
I
a
mean,
great time.
you want to go back to faith for a second. Everybody has a different idea of what God is. I believe in a benevolent God. And so for me, nature represents God, and nature, part and parcel for me. They're the same thing. And so for me, like, nature was meant to be this benevolent being. It's scary at first, and like, there's this awesome power, but then ultimately it's benevolent and it's kind. And that was important, and we also shot a lot of this on location in the woods. And that was part of it. A lot of natural light, a lot of kind of a Terrence Malick vibe, because that's, to me, that puts you in, unlike most survival movies, this movie doesn't have a bunch of manufactured spectacle. It's not like The Revenant where he's falling off a cliff and landing on a tree and then inside the carcass of a bear, and then he becomes the bear. This is very much, I always call it an emotional epic. And you're upfront and personal with those actors and the cameras in their face. And I hope that kind of, like you said, you've used the word grounding a lot. It's a very grounded movie, in both literally and philosophically.
Yeah, well, I think that it's effective. It's very immersive in that I think the setting almost becomes a character unto itself throughout this film. Maybe last question. Obviously, you're hoping people go see this movie on November 1st, and in the box office, I'm sure you'd be pleased to get some positive critical reviews. But maybe beyond to some of those standard stuff, what is it that you hope audiences, as they leave the theater having just experienced this film, like what do you hope that they sort of take with them or have gained from that experience?
Thank you for asking this question, because for me, this is like the be all end all. My goal, and I said this from the minute I read the script and interviewed for this, my goal with any movie, I feel that movies can redeem people in a way. And I don't mean that even religiously, I just mean just in general, like in a human way. every movie you see is an opportunity for redemption. And my goal is that the credits roll and you take in the message of the film, and immediately a parent goes and calls their child, or a child goes and calls their parent and tells them, "I love you." And that's happened already. I've had people come to me and say, "I was overcome and I had to immediately call my kid." And to me, that is why I made the film. That's why people should go see the film.
Yeah, well, it's a great film. I encourage you guys. I echo that. Go see this movie on November 1st because it is an enjoyable film. It's a film that I think a family can go and enjoy together. But thanks so much, Andrew. This is a busy weekend for you.
Thank you.
All the best over the next couple of days with the launch of
This
this
is
film.
great.
But thank you for taking the time just to chat about this movie.
I really appreciated your questions. Thank you.